The SUV didn't stop when the light turned red, it accelerated, engine screaming, tires shrieking against wet asphalt, and Daniel Mercer knew, in the half-second before impact, that whoever was driving it wasn't trying to beat the light, they were aiming straight for him. His hand tightened around the paper coffee cup, the cardboard sleeve bending under the sudden pressure as the world snapped into violent clarity. The crosswalk signal blinking white, the rain turning the street into a mirror of fractured neon, the faint smell of gasoline mixing with damp concrete, and then someone shouted behind him, "Watch out!" But it was too late, because the SUV clipped the front of his sedan with a sickening crunch that echoed like a gunshot down the block. Metal folding inward, glass bursting outward, and Daniel felt the jolt slam through his body, even though he wasn't inside the car, the shock of it traveling up through his feet, into his chest, as his car spun half a rotation and mounted the curb, stopping inches from where he stood frozen. His coffee slipped from his fingers, splattering against the pavement, brown liquid bleeding into rainwater as the SUV fishtailed, corrected, and then without hesitation sped off into the intersection, running the red light, disappearing into traffic like a predator slipping back into the forest. For a moment, no one moved, the city holding its breath, and then the noise rushed back in, all at once, horns blaring, someone screaming, a man across the street already pulling out his phone. "Call 911. Jesus, call 911. And Daniel's heart was pounding so hard, he could feel it in his throat, his hands shaking as he stepped toward his wrecked car, his reflection staring back at him through the shattered windshield, distorted, fragmented, like he was looking at a version of himself that had already been broken long before this moment. "Sir, are you okay?" a woman asked, her voice cutting through the chaos. But Daniel didn't answer right away, because his mind was stuck on one detail, one impossible, sickening realization that clawed its way up from the back of his thoughts. He had seen the driver's face, just for an instant, framed by the blur of motion and rain. And it wasn't a stranger, it was someone he knew. His breath caught, his chest tightening as the name formed silently on his lips. And then he shook his head, like he could physically dislodge the thought, because it didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense, and yet the image was burned into his memory with brutal clarity. "Hey, you're bleeding," the woman said, stepping closer, her hand hovering near his arm, and Daniel looked down to see a thin line of red running along his knuckles, glass embedded in the skin, but he barely registered the pain. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. And he reached for his phone with unsteady fingers, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed, the one he hadn't called in months, maybe years, his thumb hovering over the screen as doubt crept in, thick and suffocating. What if he was wrong? What if his mind was playing tricks on him? What if? But then the memory hit him again, sharp and undeniable, and he pressed the call button. It rang once, twice, 3 times, each second stretching out unbearably, and then the line clicked, a familiar voice answering with cautious irritation. "Daniel, it's 7 in the morning. What is it?" And Daniel swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of road where the SUV had vanished. Rain continuing to fall, in steady, relentless sheets. "I just got hit," he said, his voice low, controlled in a way that masked the storm inside him, by a black SUV. There was a pause on the other end, subtle but noticeable, and Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "Okay," the voice replied. Slower now, more alert. "Are you hurt?" Daniel exhaled, a humorless breath that tasted like iron and rain. "I saw your face," he said, the words dropping like stones into still water, sending ripples through the silence that followed. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the faint hum of the line, the distant noise of the city bleeding into the background, and then the voice came back, different now, stripped of its earlier casual tone, replaced by something colder, sharper. "You're mistaken," it said, and Daniel felt something inside him twist, a mixture of anger and disbelief coiling together. "I'm not," he replied, each word deliberate. "You were driving that car, Evan." Another pause, longer this time, heavy with unspoken tension, and Daniel could almost picture his younger brother on the other end, standing in whatever expensive apartment he'd moved into after leaving Chicago, running a hand through his hair, calculating, deciding. "Daniel," Evan said finally, his voice measured, "you need to calm down." And that was enough to snap something in Daniel's chest, a sharp, bitter laugh escaping him before he could stop it. "Calm down?" he echoed, glancing at the twisted wreck of his car, the flashing lights of an approaching police cruiser now reflecting off the wet pavement. "You just tried to kill me." "I didn't try to kill you," Evan shot back, the first crack in his composure, irritation bleeding through. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be standing there making phone calls. The bluntness of the statement hit Daniel like a second impact, knocking the air from his lungs in a way the crash hadn't. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his mind scrambling to catch up, to process the implications of what his brother had just said so casually. Then what the hell was that? He demanded, his voice rising despite himself, drawing the attention of a nearby officer who was now watching him with cautious curiosity. A warning, Evan said, and the words settled over Daniel like a cold weight, pressing down on him, making it harder to breathe. A warning for what? Daniel asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. Buried deep beneath layers of denial and avoidance. There was a faint exhale on the other end, almost like Evan was tired, like this conversation was an inconvenience he'd hoped to avoid. You should have stayed out of it, he said, and Daniel's stomach dropped, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening inevitability. The case, the files he'd pulled last week, the questions he'd started asking around the office, the names he'd recognized but tried to ignore. It's my job, Daniel said, though the conviction in his voice felt thinner now, strained. No, Evan replied, sharper this time. It was your job until you started digging into things that don't concern you. Daniel glanced at the police officer approaching him, a hand raised in a silent request for a moment, and the officer slowed, giving him space but not taking his eyes off him. A girl is dead, Evan, Daniel said, lowering his voice, turning slightly away. That concerns me. Another pause, and this one felt different, heavier, like it carried something more than just hesitation. You don't know anything about that girl, Evan said, quieter now, but no less firm. You're looking at pieces and pretending you see the whole picture. Daniel's jaw tightened, the frustration building in his chest. Then explain it to me, he shot back. Explain why your company's name is all over this. Explain why you're suddenly back in town after 2 years. Explain why you just ran my car off the road instead of picking up the damn phone and talking to me like a normal person. The words came out faster now, fueled by adrenaline and anger, each one pushing against the wall Evan had been carefully constructing. On the other end, there was silence again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full, dense with something Daniel couldn't quite identify. You need to walk away, Evan said finally, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before, something almost like concern, buried beneath layers of control, for your own sake. Daniel shook his head, even though Evan couldn't see it, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. You don't get to decide that for me, he said, and as the words left his mouth, he felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, like crossing an invisible line that couldn't be uncrossed. The police officer stepped closer now, gesturing toward the wrecked car, his expression expectant, and Daniel knew he couldn't stall any longer. I have to go, he said into the phone, his voice steadier now, anchored by a growing sense of resolve. Daniel. Evan started, but Daniel cut him off. If you want me to stop, he said, you're going to have to do better than a warning. And with that, he ended the call, the screen going dark in his hand as the rain continued to fall, washing away the remnants of his spilled coffee, the faint traces of blood, but doing nothing to cleanse the feeling that had settled deep in his bones that whatever he had just stepped into, it was bigger than him, bigger than his brother, and it wasn't going to let him walk away so easily. The officer cleared his throat, pulling Daniel back into the present. Sir, I'm going to need a statement, he said, his tone professional but not unkind, and Daniel nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket as he took a slow breath, trying to steady himself. But even as he began to speak, describing the SUV, the direction it had gone, the details that mattered, his mind was already racing ahead, replaying Evan's words, searching for meaning in the spaces between them, and beneath it all, one question burned brighter than the rest, refusing to be ignored. What exactly had his brother gotten himself into, and how far was he willing to go to keep it hidden? What exactly had his brother gotten himself into, and how far was he willing to go to keep it hidden? Daniel gave the officer the clean version first, because instinct and training pushed him there before conscience could object. Black SUV, he said, rubbing rainwater off his forehead with the back of his hand. Tiny grains of safety glass clung to his skin like sugar. Late model, tinted windows, headed west on Franklin. I didn't catch the plate. The lie landed flat in his mouth. He hated how naturally it came. The officer, a broad-shouldered guy with tired eyes and a damp yellow vest over his uniform, wrote on a little notepad instead of using the tablet clipped to his belt, as if paper still felt more trustworthy at a crash scene. You were outside the vehicle when it happened? Yeah. Anybody else inside? No. Anybody you know see the driver? Daniel's pulse hit harder at that. He looked toward the intersection where pedestrians had started moving again, carefully, each person making the decision to resume in their own day, because nobody could afford to stop for someone else's disaster too long. A bus hissed to a halt at the corner. A woman in scrubs stepped around a hubcap in the gutter without even looking down. The city was already erasing the moment. No, Daniel said. The officer glanced up, studying him. You sure? Daniel held his gaze a beat too long. That's what I said. The officer's expression didn't change, but something in it cooled. He nodded once and tore the top page from his pad. Tow truck's on the way. EMS can look at that hand. You should probably let them. Daniel looked at the blood drying along his knuckles in thin rust-colored streaks, and then at the EMT setting down an orange trauma bag near the curb. I'm okay. That's usually what people say right before they find out they're not. The officer handed him a card with the report number. Call if you remember anything useful. Daniel almost laughed at the word useful. Then the officer was gone, moving toward the witnesses gathered under the pharmacy awning, and Daniel was left standing beside the wreck of his car, rain tapping the roof in a soft, relentless pattern that sounded, absurdly, like fingers drumming on a desk while waiting for him to confess something. He let the EMT irrigate the cuts on his hand with a saline syringe. The cold sting sharpened everything. How'd this happen? The EMT asked, pulling a sliver of glass free with tweezers. Daniel watched the tiny fragment glint in the gray light before it fell into a metal tray. Wrong place, wrong time. The EMT made a face that suggested he'd heard that phrase from people who'd been shot, dumped, divorced, and fired in the same week. That'll do it. When the bandage was wrapped and the paperwork was stuffed into Daniel's coat pocket, he walked 3 blocks in the rain without really deciding where he was going. His shoes filled with water. His coat got heavy. The downtown streets of Chicago at that hour felt caught between shifts of power delivery trucks, double parked in loading zones, baristas dragging wet trash bags through alley doors, men in quarter zips jogging through red lights because their watches told them their hearts mattered. Daniel cut across a plaza, lined with bare trees and stainless steel benches shining with rain, then ducked into a diner he hadn't been inside since law school. A brass bell over the door gave a weak, tired jingle. Heat hit him first, then the smell. Scorched coffee, fryer oil, bleach, wet wool from coats steaming dry in the booths. A television over the pie case was playing local news with the volume off. A caption crawled along the bottom about a city ethics probe. He stood there, dripping, until a waitress in her 60s looked up from refilling sugar dispensers and pointed at a booth by the window. Sit before you make a lake, she said. Daniel slid into the cracked vinyl and peeled his damp coat open. The seat squeaked beneath him. Outside, people moved under umbrellas, and newspaper boxes gleamed red and blue under the traffic lights. The waitress set a mug down without asking. Coffee. Thanks. You look like hell. That's generous. She snorted and walked away. Daniel wrapped both hands around the mug. The ceramic burned his bandaged knuckles, and somehow that steadied him more than anything else had. He took out his phone and opened the case file again, the one he wasn't supposed to have taken home, the one that had started this spiral. Talia Rooks, 19-year, found dead in a private post-op recovery suite leased by Helix Aesthetic Partners, officially from respiratory failure, after an unlicensed sedation event. Off the books, off the schedule, off every system except the wrong backup server someone forgot to wipe. Daniel had come across her name because her mother filed a civil wrongful death action so badly drafted that it should have died in clerk review. Instead, it landed in the county office where Daniel worked compliance and risk for the city's medical licensing task force, a job that sounded important until most of his days were spent chasing expired permits and falsified continuing ed credits. But Talia's file had smell to it. Not literally, wrongness. The kind you sensed in the gaps. A dead student, a private suite, a sealed toxicology addendum, security footage missing exactly 47 minutes. And Helix, Evan's company, didn't own hospitals or surgical centers outright. It bought distressed practices, rebranded them, optimized them, squeezed them, until they gleamed in investor decks: cosmetic, dental, outpatient recovery, wellness, efficient and deniable. Daniel scrolled to the photo attached to the incident report. Talia smiling in some campus courtyard, dark curls blown across one eye, one hand lifting a coffee cup toward the camera. She looked like half the interns who pass through city offices every spring. Bright and tired and still naive enough to believe hard work bent the world toward fairness. He imagined her mother attaching that picture to pleadings with shaking hands. He imagined someone on the other side redlining language to minimize exposure. His jaw tightened. The waitress returned with a laminated menu Daniel didn't touch. You gonna eat? Or are you just here to stare at your ex-wife on your phone? Daniel blinked. It's not my ex-wife. She glanced down. Too young for that. Then definitely trouble. Also not wrong. Well, trouble gets pancakes unless it's criminal trouble. Criminal trouble gets eggs. Protein for bad decisions. She set down a water glass and moved off before he could answer. Daniel looked back at the phone. There was one message he hadn't opened yet. Time-stamped 16 minutes earlier. Unknown number. He already knew before he tapped it. Stop pretending you can tell the difference between guilt and evidence. He stared at the text until the letters lost shape. Then another message came through from the same number while he watched. Mom doesn't know I'm here. Keep it that way. Daniel typed, "Why hit me?" He deleted it. Typed, "Talk to me in person." Deleted that too. Finally, he set the phone face down and pressed his thumb to the bridge of his nose. He knew Evan's rhythms too well. His brother only became this cold when he was scared, and only became this controlled when something larger than him had put a hand on his neck. That should have made Daniel feel pity. Instead, it made him angrier. Pity required trust, and trust had been rotting between them for years. Their father's funeral had only exposed the decay. Evan in a dark suit fielding calls from investors beside the casket. Daniel in a borrowed tie helping their mother fold memorial cards because the funeral home was understaffed. Evan promising he'd take care of her. Daniel actually doing it. The old resentment moved through him with the familiar ache of a badly healed fracture. The waitress returned with eggs, toast, hash browns. "I never ordered." "I know," she said. "You looked like eggs." He almost smiled. Then his phone buzzed again, this time with a name that made the muscles in his shoulders tighten for an entirely different reason. Ada Lena Ortega. He answered on the second ring. "You tell me why CPD just emailed over a traffic incident with your name on it," Lena said without greeting. Her voice was brisk, low, awake in the way only prosecutors and insomniacs were at this hour. Daniel looked out the window at rain sliding down the glass in crooked paths. "Good morning to you too, Daniel." He heard her walking somewhere, heels quick against tile. Was it random? There were 100 ways to answer that. He chose the coward's version again. Probably not. That is not an answer suitable for a person whose calls get logged. He could see her in his mind now, dark hair pulled back, one hand around a paper file, the other braced at her hip, while she carved truth down to the bone with that dry, exhausted patience of hers. They had almost dated once, then almost testified against each other on an unrelated procurement mess. Chicago had a way of turning potential romance into administrative hostility. "I need to see you," he said. "That depends on whether you're about to make my day worse." "Almost definitely." A pause. He heard a door shut on her end. Her voice changed when she came back, more private. "Are you hurt?" The question landed softer than he expected. "Not bad. Where are you?" he told her. "Stay there," she said. "And don't talk to anybody from your office until I get there." That sounds dramatic. You were just sideswiped in the rain after pulling restricted records on a dead student, linked to a company your brother works for. Dramatic has already arrived. The line clicked dead. Daniel sat still with the phone in his hand, while the diner breathed around him, silverware clinking, fryer bubbling, a kid whining for syrup in the back booth, the muted television showing footage of aldermen stepping out of black SUVs under umbrellas. He forced himself to eat 2 bites of eggs because his hands had started to shake again, and he knew from experience that hunger made him reckless. When Lena came in 22 minutes later, she brought cold air with her, and the energy of someone who had already fought through 3 obstacles before 9 a.m. Her charcoal coat was rain-speckled at the shoulders. She spotted him immediately, and crossed the diner with that same economical stride she used in court, as if wasted motion was morally offensive. She slid into the booth opposite him, without taking off her coat. Her eyes went first to his bandaged hand, then to his face. "You look worse than not bad. The day's young. Don't start charming me. It always means you're withholding." He pushed the extra mug toward her. She ignored it, pulled a legal pad from her bag, and clicked a pen. "Start at the part you left out for police." Daniel looked down at the table. The formica was patterned to look like stone and failed. He watched a bead of rain run off his sleeve and pool near the salt shaker. Every instinct he had told him to parcel out the truth carefully, because once spoken aloud it became structure, it became strategy, it became discoverable. But another instinct, quieter and older, said he was already past the point where managing appearances could save anything. "I know who was driving," he said. Lena didn't move. "Who?" "Evan." For the first time since sitting down, she blinked hard. "Your brother?" "Yeah. And you told the responding officer you didn't see the driver." "Yeah. Why?" "Because saying it out loud makes this real in a way I wasn't ready for yet." "It is real anyway." "I know." Her jaw flexed once, not with anger exactly, more like she was forcing impatience back into its cage so she could keep working. Did he say anything? Daniel hesitated. He thought of the word warning, and how it had slid from Evan's mouth with no visible shame. He thought of the second message. Stop pretending you can tell the difference between guilt and evidence. He called it a warning, Daniel said. Lena sat back a fraction. Jesus. The waitress appeared, poured coffee into Lena's untouched mug, and vanished as if she had developed professional instincts around dangerous conversations. Lena wrapped her hands around the cup but didn't drink. Steam rose between them. Okay, she said. We're not doing this halfway. Show me everything. Daniel unlocked his phone and handed it over. Lena read the texts once, then again. Her face closed up in the way prosecutors' faces did when emotion became secondary to sequencing. Did you preserve the metadata? It's on the device. Good. Don't forward anything yet. She set the phone down carefully. Now tell me what you've pulled on the Rooks case that would make someone do this. Daniel opened the folder. As he talked, he watched her eyes track over each page, each screenshot, each timestamp. He described the least recovery suite, the scrubbed camera interval, the billing code anomalies, the name of a nurse practitioner who resigned 2 days after Talia died, and now seemed to have no forwarding address, no current license, no social footprint beyond a brother in Joliet, with 2 DUIs and a landscaping business. He explained how Helix kept appearing, one layer removed from every entity tied to the suite. Never owner on paper, always consultant, manager, vendor, operating partner, a structure designed by people who loved money more than fingerprints. Lena didn't interrupt until he mentioned the sealed toxicology addendum. How did you get that? I didn't. I got proof it exists. From where? He looked at her. Do you want the useful answer or the lawful one? That is exactly the kind of sentence that ruins my mornings. He held her gaze. An internal portal with bad permissions. She breathed out through her nose. So unlawful curiosity, not a whistleblower. If it helps, I felt guilty while doing it. It does not. But her mouth tightened at one corner, almost a smile, gone quickly. She flipped to the incident chronology and tapped a line with her pen. This says Talia arrived at the suite at 8:14 p.m. and coded at 9:03. Who authorized sedation? That's the missing piece. No, Daniel said, hearing his own certainty before he had time to soften it. Evan does. Lena looked up sharply. Because? Daniel saw again, not the crash this time, but something older. Himself at 14 sitting in the passenger seat of their father's Buick, while Evan, 17 and newly licensed, talked his way out of getting both of them arrested after shoplifting beer with boys he hated. Evan had always understood hierarchies instantly. Who mattered? Who could be moved? Who could be sacrificed? It wasn't just ambition. It was fluency. Because he doesn't threaten me over a low-level compliance review, Daniel said. He only steps in if his name is close to the flame. The diner door opened again. Cold air swept in. Daniel glanced over instinctively and saw a man in a navy overcoat pause just inside, scanning the room before heading to the counter. Late 40s. Expensive haircut. No umbrella, despite the rain. Daniel looked away, then looked back. The man wasn't ordering. He was watching the television without seeing it. Lena followed Daniel's line of sight with prosecutor precision. You know him? No. You think he knows you? Daniel considered the question longer than it should have required. There was a certain type of corporate fixer who looked bland by design, whose entire value lay in seeming forgettable. This man had that quality. Maybe, Daniel said. Lena closed the file. We're leaving. That's subtle? Subtle is for people who still have room to bargain. She stood, took out cash for the bill, and slid Daniel's phone back across the table. Listen to me carefully. You are done freelancing this. You'll amend your statement. You'll preserve your device. And until I figure out whether this is prosecutable, political, or both, you do not contact Evan again. Daniel rose more slowly, every muscle in his body now aware of fatigue. You really think it's that bad? Lena grabbed her bag and looked at him in a way that made him wish, briefly and pointlessly, that he had lied better and earlier. I think your brother tried to send a message in public at rush hour instead of meeting you privately, she said. Men do that when private options are gone. Outside, the rain had thinned to a silver mist, but the air felt colder, sharper, as if the city had exhaled and left its teeth out. Daniel stepped onto the sidewalk beside her. Traffic hissed past. Somewhere down the block, a siren started, then was swallowed by distance. He looked through the diner window and saw the man in the navy overcoat lift a phone to his ear without taking his eyes off the glass. Lena saw it too. Her hand closed around Daniel's sleeve for just a second, firm and unceremonious. Don't look back again, she said quietly. Walk. They started down the block side by side, not touching, not speaking, their reflections sliding along dark storefront windows, and Daniel felt with sudden terrible clarity that the morning had shifted from threat into process, from suspicion into machinery, and once machinery started moving, it never crushed only the guilty. And once machinery started moving, it never crushed only the guilty. Lena led him around the corner and into a narrow parking garage attached to the back of a mid-rise office building that had probably been modern in 1987 and had given up trying sometime around the second Bush administration. The concrete ceiling hung low enough to make every sound feel trapped. Water dripped steadily from a pipe overhead and struck the oil-stained floor with a hollow tick, tick, tick that seemed too precise, too patient. Fluorescent tubes buzzed in metal cages, throwing sickly white bands of light across old salt lines and puddles that reflected the underbellies of parked cars. The air smelled like wet cement, motor oil, and the faint ammonia sting of old urine from the stairwell. Daniel followed 2 steps behind her, his shoes squeaking, his bandaged hand throbbing now that the adrenaline was draining out of him in uneven waves. Lena didn't slow until they reached a gray county sedan, parked by the elevator shaft. She unlocked it, then stopped with her hand on the driver's door, and turned to face him. Before we get in, she said, I want you to decide whether you're ready to actually cooperate, or whether you still want to protect your brother by lying 1 inch at a time until this turns into a burial. Daniel stared at her. The overhead light flattened the color from her face and made the tiredness under her eyes look almost bruised. That's not fair. No, she said. It's accurate. He opened his mouth to argue and then closed it again, because the instinct that rose first wasn't outrage, it was defense. Not of himself, of Evan. That realization disgusted him. It also made him feel abruptly, painfully young. There were entire chambers in him built around excusing his brother's violence, his selfishness, his entitlement, because that had always been the family economy. Evan detonated. Everyone else interpreted. Their mother called it pressure. Their father called it talent. Daniel called it a phase, until it stopped being one. Even now, after the crash, after the threat, after the messages, part of him kept trying to place the behavior inside some frame that would make it survivable. Fear, coercion, bad judgment, desperation, anything but malice, anything but this. He looked at the concrete floor, at a dark puddle spreading around a drain clogged with cigarette filters and leaves, and said, I know how this sounds. Lena's laugh held no humor. That's the problem. You still think this is about optics. She opened the rear door instead of the front and reached in for a file box. Get in the passenger seat. He did. The interior smelled faintly of stale coffee and courthouse paper, that dry, dusty smell of copied motions and manila folders and printer toner embedded in cloth upholstery. Lena set the box on the back seat, got behind the wheel, locked the doors, and only then handed him a legal pad. Write down everything he said to you on the phone, word for word as best you can. Daniel took the pad. His fingers felt clumsy around the pen. For a few seconds, he just stared at the blank page. Outside the windshield, a man in a knit cap pushed a janitor's cart through the far end of the garage without glancing their way. Water rolled down a support column in a thin silver thread. Daniel finally lowered the pen and began. I just got hit. By a black SUV. I saw your face. You're mistaken. I'm not. You were driving that car, Evan. You need to calm down. You just tried to kill me. I didn't try to kill you. If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't be standing there making phone calls. He stopped there, breath-catching. Seeing the words in his own handwriting altered them. On the phone, they had felt slippery, monstrous, but not yet anchored. On paper, they became evidence of intent, of capability, of a version of his brother Daniel could no longer pretend he had imagined. His throat tightened. Lena watched him without interrupting. He kept writing. A warning. You should have stayed out of it. It's my job. It was your job until you started digging into things that don't concern you. A girl is dead. You don't know anything about that girl. You need to walk away. For your own sake. If you want me to stop, you're going to have to do better than a warning. He put the pen down. His heartbeat was loud inside the sealed car. Lena took the pad, read it, then rested it on the steering wheel. This is bad, she said quietly. I know. No. I need you to hear me with professional ears. This is not family drama with legal overtones. This is witness intimidation, possible attempted homicide, and maybe obstruction tied to a suspicious death in a medical setting. If even half the paper trail underneath your file is real, this could jump jurisdictions by lunch. Daniel looked out the windshield. He said I didn't know anything about Talia. That bothers you because it sounded like he did. Lena nodded once, slow. It also sounds like he thinks the facts are morally complicated enough to split people. That's a useful tactic if you need to muddy motive. She started the engine, but didn't put the car in gear. I'm taking you somewhere you can amend your statement before CPD decides they dislike surprises. Daniel turned back to her. My office will already know I accessed the portal. Probably. Then if I go in with this, I'm done there. Probably. You say probably like it's weather. Because right now I'm triaging outcomes, Daniel. Employment is not at the top of the list. The bluntness stung because he knew she was right. He leaned back against the headrest and shut his eyes for 1 second. Just one. But in that second, his father's voice arrived whole and uninvited from memory. Don't make a mess if you can help it. That had been the family creed too. Not be good. Not be kind. Not tell the truth. Don't make a mess. Daniel opened his eyes. Where are we going? A satellite office first. Then maybe homicide, maybe public corruption, maybe a federal building if the day gets ambitious. She eased the sedan into reverse. Put your seatbelt on. They drove through streets slick with rain and freighted with the usual Chicago contradiction. Old brick churches crouched beside vape shops, day laborers huddled under scaffolding across from a tower of mirrored glass, cops directing traffic around a burst water main, while a woman in expensive heels shouted into a headset and never broke stride. The storm had weakened into a fine mist that hung in the air and blurred edges. Everything looked slightly unfinished. Daniel watched the city slide by and tried to order his thoughts, but they kept breaking formation and looping back to the same points. Talia's photo, Evan's voice, the unknown man in the diner, his mother. Especially his mother. She still lived in the bungalow on the northwest side, where he and Evan grew up, a narrow brick house with a chain-link fence, hydrangeas that never bloomed right, and kitchen drawers that jammed in humid weather. She had 2 versions of each son fixed in her mind, the boys they had been and the men she needed them to remain. Daniel had spent years quietly inhabiting the more useful role, reliable, nearby, answering the call. Evan had spent years performing brilliance from a distance and being forgiven for the collateral damage because success, to her, still read as safety. He imagined her face if this surfaced publicly, not horror first. Confusion, then refusal, then a grief so embarrassed it would come out as anger. You should call her before someone else does, Lena said, eyes on the road. Daniel turned. How did you know I was thinking that? Because everyone thinks they can sequence bad news to save their mother. She merged left. They can't. If I call now, she'll panic. If you don't call, she'll feel betrayed. Daniel looked down at his hands. The bandage was already damp at the edges. He pressed his thumb into the base of his palm until it hurt. Not yet, he said. Lena didn't argue. They reached the satellite office, a squat limestone building with half its windows dark and a security desk staffed by a man who recognized Lena on sight and stopped asking questions after the second badge flash. She took him through a side corridor that smelled like floor polish and stale HVAC air, into a small interview room with beige walls, 1 table, 3 chairs, and a camera bubble in the ceiling. Bureaucratic rooms were designed to strip people down to what they said. No art, no distractions, no mercy. A detective from Major Accidents took the amended statement first, his suit jacket off, shirt sleeves rolled, a legalistic patience in every question. Daniel forced himself to stay precise. Yes, he had identified the driver as his brother. Yes, he had initially withheld that information from the responding officer. Yes, his brother had called the collision a warning. Yes, there was an ongoing matter involving a dead young woman, and records Daniel had accessed in a work capacity. Every answer seemed to harden the air another degree. The detective's pen moved steadily. Twice, he asked Daniel to repeat exact phrasing. 3 times, he asked whether Evan had been drinking, unstable, recently threatened, medicated, under unusual stress. Daniel said he didn't know. The truth was more humiliating than that. He knew some things, and not others. He knew Evan slept 4 hours a night, and treated kindness as a form of leverage. He knew Evan always tipped extravagantly, when he wanted to be remembered as decent. He knew Evan could cry on command when strategically cornered, and would hate himself afterward. Not for manipulating, but for needing to. He knew none of that fit in a police statement. After the detective left, another man entered without knocking. Older, compact, in a navy suit that looked slept in but expensive. He carried no file, which somehow made him immediately more dangerous. Assistant U.S. Attorney Peter Sloan, he said, offering no hand. I'm here because my morning went sideways. Lena, seated in the corner, folded her arms. Your morning and mine. Sloan glanced at her, then at Daniel. Walk me through Helix. Daniel felt something inside him drop. Federal. Already. I don't know enough yet. Then tell me what you know and leave the ego out of the answer. Daniel did. He spoke for 20 minutes, while Sloane remained almost unnervingly still, asking targeted questions that sliced through layers Daniel had been unconsciously using to pad uncertainty. Who leased the suite? Who benefited from record suppression? Who had authority over post-op protocols? Which shell entities touched payroll? Who inside Daniel's office might have noticed his portal access? Which regulators had previously looked at Helix facilities and gone quiet? Lena cut in only when Daniel drifted toward speculation. Fact, she would say, and he would pull back. Fact. Not fear. Not family mythology. Fact. By the end, his mouth was dry and his temples throbbed. Sloane finally stood. Here's where we are, he said. Your brother is either a mid-level fixer trying to contain an ugly death tied to revenue-generating misconduct, or he's a frightened executive carrying water for somebody richer and smarter. Either way, he hit a government employee connected to a live matter. That narrows his options. It also narrows yours. Daniel looked up. Meaning? Meaning you don't get to freelance contact, and you don't get to destroy your phone in a fit of conscience, and you don't go see your mother unless we say it won't compromise anything. The words sparked immediate anger. You can't tell me I can't see my mother. Sloane's face didn't change. I can tell you that if your mother reaches out to your brother before we know what devices he's using or who's listening around him, she becomes one more unpredictable variable in a case already short on clean variables. Daniel stood too quickly, the chair scraping hard against the tile. She's not a variable. Everybody is a variable, Sloane said. The decent ones are usually the most dangerous because they still believe private love can solve public crimes. Lena rose before Daniel could answer, one hand lifted just enough to interrupt the collision. Sit down, she said to Daniel, not gently. He's not wrong, and hating him for it won't make your mother safer. Daniel kept his feet planted for one more second, chest tight, vision sharp at the edges. Then he sat. Shame followed almost instantly, hot and sour. He hated being handled. He hated more that part of him needed it. Sloane nodded once, as if a box had been checked in his mind. Good, he said. Now we need to know whether your brother panics or recalibrates. He looked to Lena. You still have the text metadata preserved? On device. Get digital on it. He turned back to Daniel. And you should prepare yourself for the possibility that the next contact from him won't be threatening. It'll be persuasive. Men like that don't lead with confession. They lead with intimacy. The room went very quiet. Daniel understood immediately why that observation unsettled him more than the legal language had. Because it was true. Because Evan at his most dangerous wasn't furious. He was tender. He became the brother who knew which childhood memory to touch, which old wound to frame as shared, which version of himself to offer so that loyalty felt like mercy instead of surrender. Daniel had fallen for it before. The last time had been 2 years earlier, after their mother's minor stroke, when Evan flew in on a red-eye, cried in the ICU stairwell, held Daniel's shoulders, promised they'd split care evenly this time, promised not to disappear again, promised he was done being that person. By the end of the week, he was back in New York and sending money instead of showing up. Money, like apology, had always been his preferred proxy. Daniel looked at the scratched tabletop and said, more to himself than to the room, he's going to ask me to understand. Lena's expression shifted by a degree, something softer, sadder. Yes, she said, and that's the part you need to survive. Hours passed after that in a bureaucratic blur. A victim services coordinator came by with forms Daniel barely read. Someone photographed his hand. Someone else copied the messages from his phone. An investigator with a coffee stain on his tie asked him to mark on a city map exactly where the SUV had struck. By late afternoon, the rain had ended. Sun came out weakly and turned the dirty windows gold. Daniel's body felt detached from him, like a suit he had sweated through and could no longer remove. Lena was on her 4th coffee and first visible sign of fatigue, rubbing the back of her neck while talking quietly in the hall with Sloane. Daniel sat alone in the interview room and listened to the building work around him, printers starting and stopping, doors opening with soft hydraulic sighs, someone laughing too loudly down the corridor, the everyday sounds of institutions metabolizing crisis into paperwork. He was staring at the ceiling camera when his phone, returned to him but not yet back in his control, buzzed on the table. An evidence tech had left it there while extracting data. The screen lit with one name, Mom. Daniel's breath stalled. He looked toward the hallway. No one came. The phone buzzed again, then a 3rd time. She had seen something. A police call. A news scanner. Evan himself. There was no safe reason for 3 calls in under a minute. Lena stepped in just as the ringing stopped. She saw his face, then the screen. Damn it, she said softly. Daniel reached for the phone. I'm answering. Lena hesitated only a fraction, then nodded once. Speaker. He answered. Mom? For a second, all he heard was her breathing. Shallow, uneven, and the distant sound of a television turned up too loud. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin with the particular strain that made him think instantly of hospital waiting rooms and unpaid utility notices, and every other moment in life when fear had to travel through dignity before it could emerge. Where is your brother? She asked. Why are you asking me that? Daniel said, and he hated the immediate defensiveness in his own voice, because it told her something was wrong before he had chosen to tell her anything at all. On speaker, her breath hitched. He could hear the television still blaring in the background, some midday anchor using the falsely calm cadence reserved for public panic, and beneath that, the small domestic noises of her kitchen, the hum of the old refrigerator, the metallic rattle of something loose against a vent, maybe the wind tapping a branch against the side window. Home sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind that made disaster feel obscene because it had entered a place built for casseroles and utility bills and crossword puzzles done in pen. Because he was here, she said. Each word came out controlled, but only just. He came by 20 minutes ago. He looked. She stopped. Daniel pictured her standing at the yellow laminate counter in the bungalow kitchen, one hand gripping the edge so hard the knuckles blanched, her reading glasses sliding down her nose because she always forgot to push them back up when upset. He looked what? Daniel asked quietly. Lena moved closer, one hand on the back of the chair opposite him, listening without interrupting. Like he hadn't slept, his mother said, like he'd been in a fight, except there wasn't blood. He kept looking through the front curtains. He asked if you had called me. He asked if anyone from the police had come by. Then he said if you called, I was supposed to tell you to stop being self-righteous and come talk to him before strangers made this worse. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. There it was. Persuasive, exactly like Sloane had predicted, except routed through the softest target. Not tenderness directly. Family as conduit. Family as pressure point. Mom, he said, choosing each word with painful care. Did he say where he was going? Don't do that, she snapped, and the sudden sharpness of it made him open his eyes. Don't use that voice with me like I'm a receptionist and you're taking a message. Tell me what is happening. In the silence that followed, Daniel felt the room around him become hyper-detailed, as if stress had increased the contrast on everything. The scratch marks on the table, the frayed cuff of Lena's coat, the faint smear of blue ink on his thumb from the statement pad, his mother breathing into the phone. He could lie. He could still try. Tell her Evan was in some kind of business trouble. Tell her there had been an accident and a misunderstanding, and lawyers were involved. But he knew his mother's ear too well. She had spent decades hearing what men left out. She could detect omission, like a draft under a door. There was a crash this morning, he said. Her inhale came sharp and immediate. Are you hurt? Not badly. Daniel. The way she said his name carried 10 years of grievances and love and fatigue in one syllable. Were you in the car? No. Then how were you in a crash? He swallowed. My car got hit. Evan was driving. The silence on the line this time was not confusion. It was refusal arriving. He could hear it. It had a texture, like someone setting down a fragile glass carefully because if they gripped too hard it would shatter in their hand. No, she said at last. That is not funny. I'm not joking. Then you are mistaken. Lena looked down, not at him, at the floor, giving him the dignity not to witness the next wound too closely. Daniel stared at the wall and felt that old, childish desperation rising, the impossible wish not merely to be believed but to be protected by belief. Mom, I saw him. You saw someone who looked like him. He called me after. That landed. He heard the shift immediately, the way fear moved under her denial, like water under ice. Why would he call you? Because he wanted me to stop asking questions. Another silence, softer now, fraying at the edges. Questions about what? Daniel glanced at Lena. She gave one small nod. Truth. Or enough of it. A girl died, he said. There may have been wrongdoing at one of the facilities tied to Helix. I found things I wasn't supposed to find. Evan thinks I should back off. Helix? She repeated, like it was suddenly a foreign word. His company? Yes. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. It was lower, hoarser, and threaded with something more dangerous than panic. Humiliation. He came into my house, she said. He hugged me. He asked me whether you'd been sleeping. He opened the refrigerator like he still lived here. And all that time. She broke off. Daniel heard her set the phone down for a second, not ending the call. just lowering it enough that the sound blurred. Cabinet door, dish towel. A shaky breath she probably thought nobody could hear. When she picked the phone back up, the anger had found its target. "Where is he?" she asked again. Daniel looked at Lena, then away. "I don't know." "Are police looking for him?" There it was, the point of no return, or one of them. If he answered yes, his mother moved from family member to witness in her own mind. If he answered no, he protected her from that label for a few more hours at best while making everything strategically worse. He realized, with sudden sick clarity, that every choice now carried contamination. There was no preserving innocence, only deciding whose trust got poisoned first. "They want to talk to him," Daniel said finally. It was both true and cowardly. His mother let out a bitter sound that might have been a laugh if laughter could bruise. "Your father used to say one of you boys would break my heart with silence, and the other would do it with noise. I never knew which was which." Daniel felt the words like a hand closing around the back of his neck. A memory flashed up, vivid and unwanted. Their father at the dining table in an undershirt, Sunday paper folded beside his coffee, Evan charming him with a story about a school fundraiser while Daniel sat there knowing Evan had stolen money from Daniel's desk the night before. Their father had looked at both sons and smiled like this was some wonderful puzzle of temperament. One bright, one steady, each necessary to the other. Nobody in that house had known what to do with injury unless it announced itself cleanly. "Mom," Daniel said, and now his own voice was shaking. "Listen to me. If he contacts you again, you tell me immediately. You do not invite him back in. You do not call him first. You do not go looking for him. Don't you tell me what not to do in my own family." "That is exactly what I'm telling you." The force of it surprised even him. Lena's eyes flicked up. On the line, his mother went very still. Daniel pressed on before he lost nerve. "You are not safe in the middle of this if he thinks you can carry messages. He would never hurt me. I didn't think he'd hit my car either." The truth of that hung between them, raw and ugly. When she answered, her voice had gone almost flat. "No," she said. "You just never wanted to believe he could hurt you." Daniel's mouth opened, then closed, because that was true too, or true enough to wound. He had built an entire adult life around proximity to systems and distance from the central ache of his family. Rules, files, procedures, other people's negligence. Anything but the private chaos he could never quite name without sounding melodramatic. Evan had always known that. Always known Daniel's morality was real, but his sentimentality was the door you could still force with a good enough shove. "I'm sending someone to the house," Lena said suddenly, leaning closer to the phone. "Mrs. Mercer, my name is Lena Ortega. I'm with the state's attorney's office. I need you to lock your back door, close your curtains, and not leave until someone identifies themselves by name and badge." Daniel's mother did not answer immediately. Then, very quietly, "So it's that bad?" Lena chose not to soften it. "Yes." On the phone, Daniel heard her inhale and let it out slowly, the sound of someone pushing herself upright from inside a feeling she did not have time to indulge. "Fine," she said. "But when this is over, I want both my sons in one room with me, and nobody leaves until somebody tells the truth without charging by the hour." Then she hung up. For a few seconds, the dead screen reflected Daniel's face back at him, pale and older than he remembered being that morning. He lowered the phone to the table like it had gained weight. Lena stepped into the hall and called for someone immediately. Her voice clipped, efficient. Daniel stayed seated. The room felt smaller now, denser. He could almost smell the old house on his clothes, even though he hadn't been there in 3 days. Tomato soup, cedar closet. The faint medicinal odor of his mother's hand cream. He imagined Evan standing in that kitchen, opening the refrigerator, looking through the curtains, using the space like he still had a claim on it. The intimacy of that made Daniel angrier than the threat had. The crash had been spectacle. The visit to their mother was violation. Sloane came in before Lena returned. One look at Daniel's face told him enough. "He made contact with her," Sloane said. "Not a question." Daniel nodded. "He came by the house." Sloane exhaled once through his nose, then shut the door behind him. "That changes our clock." He set a slim folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed surveillance stills from traffic cameras, grainy but usable. One showed the black SUV at the intersection moments before impact. Another, captured 17 blocks later, showed it entering a private underground garage beneath a glass office tower on Wacker. Helix had regional offices on the 29th floor. Daniel stared at the image until the shape of the vehicle became undeniable, even in the blur. "We've got probable cause building," Sloane said. "Enough to lean, not enough to celebrate. Your brother may already be gone from that site, but if he used company parking, somebody got lazy." Daniel looked up. You're going after him now? I'm deciding how many doors I want open at once. Sloan tapped another photo. Evan exiting the garage an hour later, baseball cap low, overcoat collar up, one hand on his phone. The image was from above, flattening him, but Daniel knew that set of the shoulders. That impatient forward angle like the world kept being narrower than his plans. His chest tightened unexpectedly, not from pity exactly, from recognition, from the savage intimacy of seeing someone you love reduced to evidentiary stills. He looked scared, Daniel said before he could stop himself. Sloane's eyes lifted. Good. Fear makes people choose. Sometimes badly. Usually. Lena re-entered, followed by a detective Daniel hadn't met yet, a woman with close-cropped hair and a calm face that somehow made everyone else's urgency seem noisy. Patrol's on the way to your mother's, Lena said. Plainclothes outside, uniform knocking. She won't be alone. Daniel nodded once, but relief did not come. Relief required a clean perimeter, and there was none. The detective introduced herself as Cheryl Boone and placed a digital recorder on the table. I need to ask about your brother's habits, she said. Places he goes when he wants privacy. Not luxury. Privacy. Daniel leaned back, thinking. The question moved through years. Hotels first. When Evan was younger and still thought anonymity came with room service. Then members' clubs. Then other people's apartments, usually borrowed through girlfriends or friends with too much money and too little skepticism. But privacy in Chicago, true privacy, his mind caught on something he had almost forgotten. There's a boathouse, he said slowly, on the North Branch. Not really his, more like a client space. Helix used to host small donor things there in summer. In winter, it sits mostly empty. Boone's pen moved. Address? Daniel gave it. Why there? Because it's quiet. It's not home. And from the dock, you can see anybody coming. Boone nodded. Anybody else know about it? People at Helix, some board members, maybe a caretaker. Sloan and Lena exchanged a look. Not dramatic. Just efficient. Machinery adjusting gears. Boone gathered the recorder. I'll check it. She was halfway to the door when Daniel said, Wait. Everyone looked at him. He wasn't sure what he meant to ask until it was already out. If you find him, what happens if he starts talking before counsel? Boone's expression did not change. Then someone records carefully. That's not what I mean. Lena answered this time. You mean if he tries to trade? Daniel nodded. He will. Sloane's mouth flattened in a way that might have been respect or dislike. Then we evaluate the value of what he offers against the damage he's done. That's how the world works, whether you approve of it or not. Daniel looked back at the surveillance still. Evan leaving the garage. Head down. Phone at his ear. Not a monster in profile. Just a man in a coat moving through a city. That was the worst part. Evil, when it arrived in actual human settings, almost always looked administrative. And if what he offers is bigger than him? Daniel asked. Sloan met his eyes. Then your family gets smaller while the case gets larger. After they left, Lena stayed. The building had grown quieter with evening. The corridor outside dimmer now. Office chatter replaced by the intermittent slam of distant doors and the rumble of HVAC cycling harder as temperatures dropped. She sat across from him again, not with a file this time, just herself, which somehow felt rarer. You don't have to keep standing up inside your own body like you're in court, she said. Daniel let out a tired breath that almost turned into a laugh. What does that mean? It means you've been answering every emotional question, like it has an objection pending. He looked away. Through the narrow wired glass window in the door, the hallway light made a pale strip across the floor. If I stop doing that, I'm not sure what comes out. Try me. He was silent for so long that she might have thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said, I keep thinking about when we were kids and he'd break something and I'd help him clean it up before Dad got home. Not because I agreed, because I thought the version where we handled it together meant we were still brothers. His throat tightened, but he kept going. And now I can't tell whether that was loyalty or training. Lena listened without moving. Both, she said finally. Most damage in families survives by teaching itself to feel like devotion. Daniel pressed his fingers against his eyes until stars flashed behind them. If he talks, if he gives them bigger names, they'll use him. Yes. And if he doesn't, they'll bury him. Maybe. Either way, my mother loses a son. Lena was quiet for a beat. Maybe she already lost the version she was trying to keep. The words hurt because they relieved him. Relief felt disloyal. He sat back and stared at the ceiling camera again, as if it might offer some impersonal witness large enough to absorb the mess of private grief and public consequence. His phone buzzed once more on the table. A text this time, from an unknown number that no one in the room needed to identify aloud. Daniel looked at Lena. She gave a slight nod. He opened it. One line. I'm at the boathouse. Come alone if you want the truth before they turn it into paperwork. Daniel read it twice, then handed her the phone. Outside the room, footsteps quickened in the hall. Somewhere far off, a door opened. Then another, and the whole building seemed to gather itself toward motion. Outside the room, footsteps quickened in the hall. Somewhere far off, a door opened. Then another, and the whole building seemed to gather itself toward motion. Lena looked at the message once, then handed the phone to Sloane as he came through the doorway with Boone behind him. Nobody spoke for a second. The silence was not confusion. It was calculation. Daniel could see it happen in real time, each face turning the same new fact through a different machine. Prosecutorial leverage, tactical opportunity, evidentiary risk. For Daniel, the text landed somewhere less orderly. It hit like a hand reaching back through 20 years and finding the one place in him that still reacted before thinking. Come alone if you want the truth. Not if you want to save me. Not if you want to stop this. Truth. Evan knew exactly which word could bypass Daniel's anger and speak directly to the flaw beneath it. He had always known. When they were boys and Evan got caught cheating on a chemistry exam, he didn't deny it to Daniel. He came into Daniel's room after midnight, sat on the floor with his back against the bed, and said, "You want the truth?" Like offering a gift. Then he told some long, wounded story about scholarships and pressure and their father's expectations until Daniel ended up comforting him instead of condemning him. The facts had never mattered less than the frame Evan put around them. Daniel felt that old trap click shut inside his chest now. Sloane broke the silence first. He wants control of the venue, he said. He wants the emotional advantage. He also may believe he can still pull his brother off center. Boone took the phone, photographed the screen, then zoomed in on the metadata extraction still running in a separate app. We can move on it, she said. Question is whether we move with him aware or unaware. Aware, Lena said immediately. He invited Daniel, not law enforcement. If he sees a perimeter too early, he'll bolt or destroy whatever he's holding. Sloane looked at Daniel. Would he be holding anything physical? Daniel stared at the message. His own reflection floated faintly in the black edges of the screen, pale and warped. Maybe, he said, if he thinks he needs insurance. Evan doesn't like carrying documents unless he has to, but he likes leverage he can touch. Makes it feel more real. Drives? Paper? A phone? Boone asked. Could be any of that. Daniel stood before anyone told him to. I'm going. Four heads turned toward him at once. Sloane's expression hardened into exactly the kind of authority Daniel usually resented on sight. No, you are not going anywhere alone. That's not what I said. You're a civilian complainant tied emotionally to the target. He won't talk if he thinks I'm wired to the ceiling. Lena stepped closer before Sloane could answer. Then we make sure he doesn't think that. Her voice was calm, but Daniel could see how tired she was now, in the minute strain around her eyes, the way she rolled one shoulder back like something in her neck had locked up. If we send a team cold, he'll smell it. If Daniel goes with structure around him, we might get him talking long enough to make choices. Sloane gave her a look that belonged to conversations they had clearly had before, old arguments dressed in new clothes. You want to run an off-book consensual with family volatility and a collision suspect who may already be escalating? I want him in a place where he can be seen, heard, and stopped, Lena said. Right now, that place is the boathouse. Boone leaned against the table, arms folded. I can place units on the access roads, one by the river path, one at the rear lot, unmarked, no lights. If Mercer goes in with a wire, we listen. If Evan starts to move or goes hands-on, we collapse the perimeter. No, Daniel said. They all looked at him again. He kept his voice steady with effort. No wire. Sloane let out a brief, humorless breath. Absolutely not. If he sees even a hint of one, this is over. If you go in dark, this is malpractice. Daniel's temper flashed so fast it surprised him. This is my brother, not a training exercise. Exactly, Sloane snapped. Which is why I don't trust your judgment inside the blast radius. The words hit and stayed. Daniel felt the room narrow, the fluorescent light suddenly too bright, the stale conditioned air too thin. For one ugly second, he wanted to lunge at the man, or leave, or call Evan directly, and cut every institution out of it, just to prove he still had agency. He recognized the impulse for what it was, panic disguised as autonomy. He hated that recognition almost as much as he hated Sloane for provoking it. Lena moved in before the moment could calcify. He's right about one thing, she said to Daniel. You do not get to improvise because you feel emotionally fluent with the danger. Then, to Sloane. And you're wrong about one thing. He's not a random civilian. He's the reason Evan is reaching at all. We either use that, or we surrender it. Boone looked from one to the other and said, I can conceal a transmitter in the watchband. No chest wire, no obvious clip, no pat-down profile. Audio won't be perfect, but it'll be enough. Daniel looked at her. If I say no, then I tell the AUSA you're non-compliant, and he gets a warrant race, moving instead of a meet. Daniel's jaw tightened. He turned away and walked to the narrow window in the door, staring at the dim hallway beyond it without seeing. His mind was moving too fast and too old at the same time. He could feel multiple versions of himself arguing at once. The boy who still wanted one unguarded conversation with his brother before the state laid hands on him. The man who knew unguarded conversations were exactly how damage kept renewing itself. The son who could hear his mother saying both my sons in one room. The investigator who knew truth obtained privately had a way of dying privately too. He thought of Talia's photo, 19, smiling into a future that had not known it was already shortening. Whatever happened at the boathouse was no longer just about blood or betrayal. Somebody else's daughter had already paid for their family's capacity for silence. He turned back. Fine, he said. The watch. Boone nodded once and was already reaching for her phone. The next 40 minutes blurred with tactical choreography. A tech fitted the transmitter into a black watch Daniel barely recognized as modified. Boone walked him through how not to touch it. Sloane outlined boundaries in a tone that made clear these were not suggestions. No physical exchange unless necessary. No entering any secondary room without verbalizing it. No getting in a vehicle. No agreeing to leave the property under any circumstances. Lena stood just off to the side during most of it, watching Daniel in the way paramedics watch people who insist they can walk. At one point, when Boone left to coordinate positions and Sloane stepped into the hall for a call, Lena approached with Daniel's coat draped over one arm. You can still refuse, she said quietly. Daniel took the coat. The fabric was cool and faintly damp at the cuffs from earlier rain. Can I? Legally? In some ways. Morally? I don't know. Personally? Probably not. He gave a tired, crooked smile that did not last. You always this encouraging? Only with men who confuse martyrdom and closure. He put on the coat slowly, testing the weight of the watch on his wrist. It looked ordinary. That somehow unsettled him more. What if he's actually telling the truth? He asked. About what? That there's context. That Talia's death wasn't simple. That somebody above him forced this. Lena's face softened by a fraction. Then the truth is still not made cleaner by attempted murder. He'll say he didn't mean to hit me that hard. He may even believe that. She held his gaze. Daniel, people who live inside systems like Helix get very talented at reframing harm as operational miscalculation. Don't let him sell you remorse packaged as nuance. He nodded, but the warning did not settle cleanly because it had already arrived too late. Nuance was where he lived. Nuance was how he had made a career out of messy facts without losing his stomach. Nuance had become, somewhere along the way, the elegant cousin of denial. They left through a rear exit into evening. The city had entered that winter blue hour when everything metallic deepened, and every storefront glow looked lonelier than it did at full dark. The air smelled like river damp and car exhaust, and the distant sweetness of roasted nuts from a cart on the corner. Daniel rode in the back of Boone's unmarked sedan, while Lena sat up front and spoke in short bursts into the phone with units already moving into place. Buildings slid past in hard-edged silhouettes. Office towers turned to warehouses, warehouses to chain-link lots, and low industrial sheds. The streets near the North Branch felt half-abandoned after business hours. A geography of loading docks, silent tow yards, brick facades with painted signs from companies that no longer existed. When they turned onto the access road by the river, the world seemed to open and empty at the same time. The boathouse sat back from the street behind a rusting gate left conveniently ajar, a long, low structure of weathered timber and dark windows with a narrow dock extending into black water. A weak security lamp over the side entrance cast a yellow cone across damp gravel and dead reeds. Beyond it, the river moved thick and silent, reflecting fragments of city light in broken vertical bands. Boone parked 2 blocks away beneath an overpass. The concrete above them groaned occasionally as traffic crossed. Unit set, she said, looking at Daniel in the rearview mirror. 1 south access, 1 north path, 1 riverside if he tries the dock. You walk in alone. We hear what we hear. If I tell you to exit, you exit. No heroics. Daniel nodded. His mouth was dry. He opened the door and the cold hit immediately, clean and cutting. Gravel crunched beneath his shoes as he walked toward the property. Each step felt both deliberate and unreal, as though he had already become the watched version of himself. The security lamp hummed, Somewhere out on the water, a line clinked softly against a metal cleat. The boathouse loomed larger up close, its wood warped silver gray with age. The boards around the dock swollen dark from years of weather. He could smell wet lumber, river mud, old gasoline, the mineral chill of standing water. His heart was beating hard enough now that he wondered whether the microphone would pick it up. At the door, he paused just long enough to become aware of his own breathing, then pushed it open. Warmth met him first, but not much. The interior smelled of dust, stale heat, mildew beneath expensive cologne, and the faint citrus-clean note of a place that had been wiped down too recently for genuine use. The main room was larger than he remembered, one half arranged for events with a long, reclaimed wood table, stacked folding chairs, pendant lights over a dry bar, the other half still visibly functional as a launch area, with racks for oars, life vests hanging in neat faded rows, a roll-up door facing the dock. Lamps had been switched on rather than the overheads, creating islands of amber light and long shadows between them. Evan stood by the far windows with a tumbler in one hand, city lights behind him, making his face hard to read at first. He wore dark slacks and a charcoal sweater under a coat he hadn't bothered to remove. His hair looked damp at the temples. He seemed thinner than Daniel remembered from the last family holiday, but that might have been tension pulling everything tighter. For a beat, neither brother moved. Daniel noticed absurd details because the important ones were too large to touch immediately. The ice in Evan's glass had nearly melted. One cuff button on his coat was loose. There was mud on the right hem of his trousers, and on the table beside him sat a leather folio and a phone turned face down. Evan set the tumbler aside. "You came." Daniel stayed near the door. "You made that sound like a test." "Everything is a test right now." Evan's voice was tired, but not cracked. Controlled, as always, though the control seemed more costly than it used to. Daniel took another step inside and let the door swing shut behind him. The click sounded too loud in the room. "You hit my car." Evan rubbed a hand over his mouth and looked down briefly, almost like the gesture embarrassed him. "I know." "That's it? What do you want, Daniel? Immediate sainthood?" The old, instinctive fury rose so quickly Daniel had to clamp his teeth on it. "I want to know if you're insane." Evan gave a short laugh that died fast. "No, just late." He gestured toward the table. "Sit down. I'll stand. Suit yourself." Evan moved to the table, opened the folio, and pulled out a thin stack of papers and a flash drive. He didn't hand them over yet. He laid them flat, aligning the edges with fastidious little taps that Daniel recognized from childhood homework nights, the way Evan used neatness to mimic calm. "Before anybody else gets to narrate this," Evan said, "you need to understand what happened to that girl." Daniel's throat tightened. "Then say her name." Evan looked up. For a second, something genuine flickered in his face, not guilt exactly, something more destabilizing, like memory. "Talia," he said. The room seemed to contract around the sound. Daniel stayed still, every sense stretched. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, water struck wood in a slow, rhythmic slap. Evan rested both palms on the table and stared down at the papers before continuing. "She wasn't supposed to be there that night for a procedure," he said. "She was there because she found out something she shouldn't have and came to confront someone who was." He stopped, inhaled once, and when he lifted his head again, the mask of control had thinned enough for Daniel to see the fear underneath it clearly for the first time. "And if you let the wrong people get ahead of this story," Evan said, "they will bury her twice and call it cleanup." "And if you let the wrong people get ahead of this story," Evan said, "they will bury her twice and call it cleanup." Daniel did not move. He was aware of the watch on his wrist with an almost unbearable intensity now, the hidden transmitter turning his pulse and breath into something shared, turning this room into both confession and trap. He wondered, with a flash of grim absurdity, whether Evan could hear the difference in his silence from all the silences that had come before in their lives, whether this one sounded more final. "Start at the beginning," Daniel said. His voice came out lower than he expected, roughened by cold and restraint. Evan gave a small nod, as if he had hoped for exactly that phrasing. He pulled out a chair, but did not sit. Instead, he leaned his fingertips against its back, eyes on the papers. 3 months ago, Helix began due diligence on a chain of recovery suites that were bleeding cash but had the right payer mix and almost no oversight. Small footprint, cosmetic, dental, light sedation, the kind of places nobody thinks about until somebody doesn't wake up. He glanced up. "I wasn't overseeing the medical operations. I was brought in to clean the structure before acquisition. Vendors, shell managers, compliance exposure, local political grease." Daniel felt his jaw tighten at the familiar executive language. Clean the structure. Grease. Words that transformed wrongdoing into maintenance. "You always talk like that when you're scared," he said. Evan's mouth twitched without humor. I always talk like that when plain language gets people killed. The words landed with enough force to make Daniel look at him harder. Evan looked exhausted. Yes, and strung tight. But underneath that, there was something else. Daniel recognized only because he had seen it once before in a hospital hallway after their father's aneurysm. Not grief. Not exactly. The shock of a man discovering he was not smarter than mortality after all. Evan continued. One of the consultants attached to the suite on Halstead had been siphoning inventory and laundering controlled substances through fake post-op accounts, mostly sedatives. Small amounts at first, then larger. He tapped the flash drive. We found discrepancies. I pushed for a quiet internal review before the acquisition closed. Somebody above me pushed back. Who? Daniel asked. On paper? Nobody. In practice? The board's risk committee was being steered by outside counsel and one investment partner who did not want timing disrupted. Daniel took a step closer to the table. Names. Evan exhaled. I'll give you names. Now. You'll get them. But if I say them before you understand why Talia was there, you'll hear the rest as damage control. Daniel almost laughed at the audacity. And what is it now? A chance, Evan said, and for the first time his voice cracked, just slightly, enough to expose the effort underneath it. Maybe the last one I have. Daniel looked at the leather folio, the flash drive, the stack of printed emails and spreadsheets. Evidence assembled like an offering. Insurance, like he'd predicted. But not just that. Evan's hands were trembling almost invisibly where they rested on the chair back, a tiny vibration at the fingers. Daniel had never seen his brother shake. Talia's mother cleaned offices in one of the buildings Helix used for overflow records, Evan said. Part-time janitorial contractor. Talia sometimes helped her on weekends when she needed extra money. Smart kid. Curious. Too curious. He swallowed and looked past Daniel for a second, as if the next part required a fixed point somewhere over his shoulder. She found paper files that should have been shredded, patient lists that didn't match digital records, sedation logs with duplicate initials. She took pictures. Then, instead of going to police, she went where most 19-year-olds go first when they think adults will lie to them. She went looking online for somebody attached to the company who looked human. Daniel said nothing. He already knew where this was going. Evan looked back at him. She emailed me. The air seemed to thin in the room. Outside, a gust moved across the river, and the dock line knocked harder against the cleat, a sharp, repetitive tick. You knew her, Daniel said. It was not a question. Evan's face tightened. I met her twice. First over coffee, because she said she had information, and she was scared to send it blind. Second, at the suite, because I told her I was going to get her proof the operation had already been flagged internally, and she shouldn't trust anyone who tried to settle her out. Daniel stared at him. You told a 19-year-old student to meet you at a private recovery suite at night? I told her to meet me after hours because I believed I had contained the people inside the building. Believed. Yes. The single word sat there like a body. Daniel walked the rest of the way to the table and put both hands on it, leaning in. His bandaged knuckles hurt against the wood. What happened? Evan looked at the papers again, then chose one sheet and slid it across. A security printout. 2 entries. Timestamped. Talia Rooks, 8:14 p.m. Evan Mercer, 8:27 p.m. Another name below them, at 8:19 p.m. Dr. Adrian Vale. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Vale. The name was public enough to ring, but not from any case file. Fundraisers. Magazine profiles. A face on hospital wings and philanthropy panels. Chief medical strategist for one of Helix's partner funds. The kind of man who stood near governors without seeming political. He was there? Daniel said. Evan nodded once. He wasn't supposed to be. Neither was I, technically. But someone tipped him that Talia had copies. Copies of what? Logs. Side agreements. Internal messages about rewriting sedation incidents as panic responses. Enough to make a mess, not enough to convict by itself. Daniel's mind was moving fast now, constructing and dismantling possibilities. Did Vale kill her? Evan flinched at the bluntness, and Daniel saw immediately that the answer would not be clean. She came in hot, Evan said quietly. Angry, loud, not stupid. She thought I was bringing her documentation. Instead, she found Vale in the suite and realized I had underestimated who was already in motion. She tried to leave. He blocked the hallway. They argued. I got there minutes later. Daniel's hands curled against the table. Minutes. Yes. Evan took the word without defending it. When I walked in, she was conscious, disoriented, furious. There was an open crash cart and a nurse practitioner named Soraya Pike trying to explain that Talia had had a panic event and they had to stabilize her. He made the quotation marks with 2 fingers, disgust flickering briefly through his control. Talia kept saying nobody had permission to touch her. She was trying to stand up. Vale told me to help calm her down before she made things worse for herself. Daniel felt a surge of nausea so abrupt he had to breathe through it. And what did you do? Evan didn't answer right away. In that pause, Daniel saw it. The one fact his brother could root around, rename, contextualize, but not erase. I told Soraya to stop, Evan said at last. She hesitated. Vale overruled me. He said Talia had already been administered a low dose and was becoming a liability. Talia reached for her phone. Vale grabbed her wrist. I pulled him off her. She stumbled backward, hit the edge of the counter, then tried to run. His voice had gone flatter now, as if the only way through memory was to reduce it to sequence. There was a struggle in the corridor. Soraya pushed past me with another syringe. I thought she was bluffing. She wasn't. Talia jerked away. The needle caught badly. Half the dose, maybe. Maybe more. She started to lose motor control almost immediately, Daniel whispered. Jesus. Evan laughed once, a dead sound. He wasn't there. The statement should have sounded theatrical. It didn't. It sounded tired. Daniel looked at the printout again because the alternative was looking directly at his brother while imagining a terrified 19-year-old losing the use of her body under fluorescent lights. And then? He asked. Evan lifted both hands, palms open, then let them fall uselessly to his sides. Then everything happened the way these people always imagine they can manage. Vale said, we call nobody until we knew exactly what she had copied and to whom she'd sent it. Soraya insisted the dose alone wouldn't stop her breathing unless something else was in her system. Talia was on the floor trying to form words. I remember kneeling beside her and not understanding at first why she couldn't focus her eyes. She was looking at me like I had become the answer to a question too late. His own eyes had gone bright now, not with tears exactly, but with the strain of holding them back. I told Vale I was calling 911. He said if I did that with the wrong records in the room, acquisition collapsed. A dozen facilities got raided, patients got stranded, and every opportunist in the state would act shocked while taking bids on the carcass. He said there was still a path to handle it internally if Soraya could reverse enough. Daniel stared at him. And you listened? For about 40 seconds, Evan snapped, anger flaring for the first time with real heat. 40 seconds too long, yes. Then I called for an ambulance myself. By then, she was cyanotic. The word seemed to hang in the warm, stale air like an accusation from another discipline, cold and exact. Daniel's chest ached. So, she died because all of you treated her like an exposure problem before you treated her like a person. Evan looked at him as though he would have preferred a blow. Yes, he said. No hedging, no corporate varnish, just yes. Daniel took his hands off the table and stepped back because the force of the answer destabilized him more than any partial denial would have. He turned away, toward the window, and saw his own reflection in the dark glass with the river behind it. A man in a coat. A room full of amber light. A brother confessing in careful increments while people listened in the dark beyond the walls. He thought of Talia's mother pushing a janitor's cart through polished halls after hours, while decision-makers converted her daughter's final minutes into risk. His throat burned. Then why hit me? He asked without turning around. Why not come in and tell this immediately? Evan was quiet long enough that Daniel looked back. His brother had moved now, one hand braced against the table, the other pressed flat over his own mouth as if holding something in. When he dropped the hand, he seemed older by years. Because I tried, he said. Not to police, to my general counsel, to the board liaison, to a partner I thought still had limits. And every version of the answer was the same. Wait. Contain. Protect the enterprise. They told me Vale had relationships with hospital systems, pension money, state people, donors, media. They said if this came out wrong, it wouldn't just be one death. It would be collapse. Thousands of jobs, facilities shuttered, patients displaced, suits everywhere, politicians pretending they'd never taken a call. He shook his head, once, disgusted at himself as much as them. I told myself I needed time to pull enough proof that if I went down, I didn't go down alone. Then you started digging before I had everything. Daniel laughed then, sharp and unbelieving. So you tried to run me off the road because I threatened your timeline? I tried to scare you out of the file before they noticed you mattered. You insane bastard. Probably, Evan said. But not in the way you think. I knew if they clocked you as more than a bureaucrat with curiosity, they would pressure me through you or pressure you directly. I thought if you backed off early, I could still put something together clean enough to trade. Daniel felt fury and sorrow collide so hard inside him they became almost indistinguishable. You don't get points for only wanting intimidation. I know that. Do you? Daniel stepped forward again, voice rising. Do you actually know that? Or are you still in that mode where every monstrous thing becomes regrettable logistics because it helps you breathe? Evan's face hardened, then cracked again under the effort of holding shape. I know I watched a girl die because I underestimated men. I thought I was smart enough to manage, he said. I know I spent weeks moving evidence around like I was preserving leverage, when really I was postponing the part where I'd have to stand under what I'd done. I know I came to Mom's house today because some part of me still thinks if I stand in a familiar kitchen, I can remain a son instead of what I am. He stopped, jaw tight, eyes wet now, whether he wanted them that way or not. Is that enough self-knowledge for you? Daniel had no answer ready. The question struck too close to his own secret fear, that self-knowledge was often just vanity wearing a hair shirt. He looked at the flash drive on the table. What's on it? Board emails. Vale's texts with Soraya. Draft talking points for the wrongful death response. A spreadsheet of facilities with sedation anomalies they buried during acquisition. And a voice memo. Of what? Evan's gaze drifted past Daniel again, to somewhere in the room only he could see. Talia, he said. I hit record on my phone when I walked into the hallway because I thought I might need proof Vale was there. I forgot it was running until after the ambulance left. Daniel went still. Outside, the wind shifted. The roll-up door shuddered slightly in its tracks. If the recording existed, then somewhere there was sound, panic, orders, delay, a human being dying in the middle of people choosing language. The room seemed to bend around that fact. Give it to me, Daniel said. Evan put his hand over the flash drive, not quite withdrawing it, not quite surrendering it. If I hand this over straight, they'll take it, they'll use parts, and they will build a story where I'm useful enough to keep alive until I'm not. Vale will move first. Others will run. Mom will read whatever version lands in print and spend the rest of her life asking which son was the lie. Daniel's voice dropped. You lost the right to script what happens next. Evan's shoulders sagged a fraction, and in that moment, Daniel saw all the versions of his brother layered at once. The brilliant older kid who could fix a bike chain blindfolded, the 17-year-old who smiled through punishment and learned nothing, the polished executive in magazine profiles, the frightened man in a boathouse with death on a flash drive. I know, Evan said. Then, softer. I just wanted one person to hear it from me, before it became exhibit numbers. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. In his earless, unwitnessed inner life, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not even mercy. Just the collapse of one last childish hope that explanation might still restore proportion. It couldn't. What Evan had done and failed to do would remain exactly as heavy, whether spoken privately or read aloud in court. But the desire behind the confession, the stupid human desire not to vanish entirely into the worst thing you'd enabled, Daniel understood that too well to mock. He reached for the flash drive. Evan didn't resist this time. The metal was cold against Daniel's palm. He took the papers too, stacking them carefully because his hands needed a job that wasn't shaking. They're already here, Daniel said. Evan's eyes flicked up sharply. Not surprise, exactly. More like confirmation of a suspicion he'd been entertaining from the moment Daniel walked in. The watch, he said. Daniel didn't answer. Evan looked at his wrist, then gave a small, exhausted nod. Of course. He laughed once under his breath. You always did need a system in the room before you'd trust yourself. Daniel felt the hit of that, because it was cruel and true. And tonight, maybe what saved more than one life. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls, gravel crunched. Then another step, then silence again, disciplined, and waiting. Evan heard it too. He straightened slowly. When they come in, he said, don't let them talk to Soraya without the files cross-checked first. She'll fold the minute Vale points a finger, and she'll lie in whichever direction buys her daylight. Daniel closed his hand around the drive. Tell that to them. I will. Evan looked toward the dark window, where his reflection and Daniel's stood side by side for a brief, warped second. If they let me. The door behind Daniel opened hard enough to strike the interior wall, and Boone's voice cut through the room, sharp and absolute. Hands where I can see them. Now. Evan did not run. That, more than anything, made Daniel's chest constrict. His brother lifted his hands slowly, palms out, the motion almost formal. Boone entered first with two officers behind her, weapons low but ready, Lena just behind them, face set in the kind of focus that erased everything but sequence. Sloane came last, not rushing, eyes already on the table, the papers, the drive in Daniel's hand. The room changed instantly from confession chamber to scene. Air repositioned around authority, light sharpened, bodies found lanes. Boone moved to Evan, cuffing him with efficient, practiced motions while he complied without comment. Metal clicked. One officer cleared the side room. Another moved to the dock door. Lena came straight to Daniel. "Are you okay?" she asked, quiet enough that the question almost disappeared beneath the other sounds. Daniel looked at the cuffs closing around Evan's wrists and answered honestly, because anything else would have been obscene. "No." Lena's eyes held his for one beat, then dropped to the flash drive. She took it carefully, like something volatile, and passed it to Sloane, who slid it into an evidence bag without triumph. Evan turned his head then, not toward the officers, but toward Daniel. There was no dramatic plea in his face now, no last-minute bargain, just exhaustion and something like recognition. "Call her before they do," he said. Daniel knew immediately he meant their mother. Boone started to move him toward the door. Daniel said, "Evan." His brother stopped. For a moment, the entire room seemed to pause with him. Daniel had no prepared speech. Nothing cinematic arrived. Only the stripped-down truth of what remained. "Talia deserved better than both of us," he said. Evan closed his eyes once, brief and hard, as if taking the blow where it belonged. "I know," he said. Then they took him out into the cold. The river kept moving beside the boathouse, indifferent and black, carrying the broken city lights north under the dock while inside, the machinery of consequence finally began its clean, merciless work.